So Jon Anik here with you, the UFC lead commentator. You hear his voice on every UFC pay-per-view. Jon, we've got so much to talk about in the UFC right now. It's a very busy time. Just coming off of 297, 298's coming up, looking ahead to 300. Just so many things happening in that world. But I can't bury the lead here. I do have to ask about your remarks this week on the Anik and Florian podcast. You were expressing some frustration with what you called the MMA space, this MMA space for the negativity that often follows close fights, like Dricus du Plessis win over Sean Strickland at 297. And you followed with not so subtle hints that you might be moving on to something else come 2026. How serious were you about this idea?
Well, I think I got a little bit emotional on the podcast. I'm usually pretty good at keeping those emotions in check, but certainly I think my passion leads the dance oftentimes, for better or for worse. And I guess just a lot of the alleged bias really sort of stuck with me this time around, as if somehow there's some pre-fight objective or some in-fight narrative that we are trying to push. I think when you put in as many hours as we do, hearing alleged bias in volume was tough for me to take, but I really didn't think much of it. I mean, I feel like maybe it was a slow news day and it got repurposed a lot more than I thought it would. I had a full 2-hour podcast on Monday with Dricus du Plessis. If I really had some grand initiative with this, I probably would have said it then. It was sort of a throwaway on Wednesday, and I obviously didn't realize it would have this type of traction. I feel the love from the fans and the fighters, and it obviously warms my heart, and I appreciate all of that, but I'm certainly not looking for love or, looking for attention. So it's been an interesting 24 hours, but I guess I'm glad to be out the other side.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that almost grew organically because there were a lot of people who kind of heard that and they got very like triggered by the idea. It's like, we're not gonna have Jon Anik. We can't chase him away. We need Jon Anik. There really was a lot of love from media, fans, fighters. I saw some nice comments from Matt Brown earlier today as well. You obviously you love to see that and that kind of thing, but is there reason for anyone to be concerned, or was that just really venting? You're just kind of a little frustrated.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming to my defense, and even those people who thoughtfully don't want to come to my defense. I've sort of tried to tune out some of that noise, but I guess I'm just not looking to be a headline, right? Like, I devote my entire professional life, and really I've devoted my personal life to this in a lot of respects, but to do right by these athletes. And I think that when something like this happens, I've established enough goodwill with the roster that it allows me to navigate these situations, but certainly not trying to register on the radar of my agent nor my bosses. So it is what it is. But my contract is up in 2026 and I have the job that I want. So hopefully this doesn't prevent me from keeping it.
Sure, sure. Now, of course. Now, speaking of that growing negativity, especially on MMA social media, I think that's something a lot of people are really noticing. It's not just you. I think we all kind of see there's a different tone to the conversation a lot of the time. You're just one guy, I know, to borrow your words, but when you look at that, what do you attribute that to? Is it the growing sports betting? Is it people getting frustrated with their bets? Is it just social media in general? What's your take?
So it's hard for me to pinpoint what exactly it might be. I have just noticed that it's harder for me to interact with a lot of the fans that really have questions or comments on the broadcast that are fruitful or constructive. And I'm having a harder time getting to those conversations because the percentage of negative stuff is just heightened. And I think the tone to it is just a little bit different and maybe a little bit angrier. So I don't know if it speaks to a younger generation, a sports betting generation. I really don't know. And I really don't care, with total respect. Like, that flies in the face of maybe me going on my podcast and, sounding emotional, but I don't really know exactly what lies at the heart of it. But I do feel like the onus is on me as one of the forward facing members of this company to be there, to be a conduit for fans. Joe Rogan would probably love to be able to engage with people. Every time he posts something, he probably has 20,000 mentions within a minute, right? So I feel a certain responsibility to be there for the fan base. And perhaps that's against my better judgment at times, but that's what I'm going to continue to do. And, I just hope that, we can just clean it up a little bit, because it's a great sport. And I think it's attracted some people that don't sort of understand what this sport is really all about.
Sure, sure. Now, obviously, when I reached out to you, this was even before any of this happened, before you'd even done that episode of the podcast. I had every intention of talking to you about some of these other topics, and I want to get to that now. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on especially the big UFC news of the week. Kayla Harrison finally making her way over to the UFC. I know, she was originally shopping her services a few years ago. PFL had matching rights so she wasn't able to go anywhere she wanted. We know UFC CEO Dana White loves needle movers. Do you see her as a needle mover?
Without question. And I can't speak to internal metrics, right, in terms of our biggest pay-per-view stars. Aljamain Sterling comes out and says he expected more money when he headlined against Sugar Sean O'Malley, right? So I don't know what the internal metrics say, but my gosh, man, like if me and Laura Sanko and everybody else wasn't looking forward to calling this woman's fights, right? I mean, she's a huge, huge get for the UFC. And I do find it interesting that so much has been made of the fight before the fight. And no doubt Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, a fight week for UFC 300. Not going to be fun days necessarily for Kayla Harrison, right? We'll make it a short fighter meeting, Kayla, I promise. But a lot of people are making it about that. And this is the type of athlete that I really don't worry about. I was pleasantly surprised to read today that she's already had a practice cut. But the division, I think, is ripe in a lot of respects, right? With respect to the new champion, Raquel Pennington, a lot of big fights for Kayla. And the big fights in the UFC were going to happen at 135 pounds. I have said if Amanda Nunes is going to come back, and I said this before Kayla Harrison signed with the UFC. I've been saying it for about a year, but it's going to take someone like Larissa Pacheco, right? Who is on this otherworldly tear and can make weight and realize success in multiple divisions to get Amanda to come back. All right, everybody's talking about Larissa Pacheco. Amanda's retirement ends. Kayla Harrison, I think, is another fight that would be of some appetite to Amanda Nunes. And not to make it about Amanda on this day, but it's huge for the UFC. Kayla's dripping with class. She's a master orator as well. I love listening to her. I'm very excited to have Kayla in the fold, and nobody will be happier than me when I can say 136 pounds, the official weight for Kayla Harrison.
And the funny thing is, we're talking about you bringing Amanda Nunes here, and I think justifiably so. It's the same orbit, right? But these two women, they are friends. That I've spoken with Kayla before, and she's talked about going to each other's kids' birthday parties and stuff like that. There's a friendship there. Obviously, we know how to put that aside in the sport. Some do, some can't. Do you think that that's still something that entices her enough to come back? Yeah.
Not that fight right now. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sort of projecting in the future that those two women, if they realize success, Holly Holm's going to have a whole lot to say about this in theory, right? But if Kayla Harrison is able to navigate that challenge and get herself into a championship setting and get a UFC belt, Amanda Nunes is a competitor, right? She's a dear friend, but she would punch me right in the mouth if she had to. Amanda Nunes is the ultimate competitor. I reserve that distinction for Daniel Cormier and a select few others, but she is so driven by competition that whatever friendship she had with Kayla, if she was itching to come back, my informed speculation is that Amanda Nunes would have no problem signing on the dotted line, and neither would Kayla for the right price.
Sure, and you brought up Holly, of course. Holly almost seems to be the afterthought here in a lot of fans' minds. She's a deep underdog right now, very heavy underdog coming into this one already with the way the line opened up. She's 42, but realistically, she's a former champion and she has made this weight before. Are people sleeping on her too much?
Yeah, I mean, she's another athlete that I put on that competition level. So yeah, I think in some respects, I haven't even seen the betting line. I've certainly seen the headlines that suggest that Kayla Harrison is the favorite and
I think
perhaps
she's plus 300, Holly is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big number. And certainly a lot of MMA cappers would suggest that they won't even look at that fight until they see Kayla Harrison on the scale. I do think age is just a number for someone like Holly. Her style hasn't changed a whole lot. Largely, she has been competitive. Her schedule has been among the most ruthless in terms of strength of schedule in UFC history. So I worry maybe more about a fighter with an extended layoff fighting into their 40s or seeing some obvious decline on film. But I think Holly Holm can be, at the very least, a top 10 fighter, probably till she's 45, if this is what she really wants to keep doing. So, no, I think she'll be just drooling to try to upset all of this noise, if I know Holly.
And of course, this is at UFC 300. Cards filling out pretty nicely now. It's
Yeah.
getting pretty stacked. A few title fights, BMF belts in there. We might still see more to come, even in that respect. It seems like there's at least one more title fight yet to be announced. At least it feels that way, right? But do you look at this card, and obviously there's not like that true megastar we had first for 100 and 200, Brock Lesnar, right? It's missing quite that level. There's not necessarily the modern equivalent here with Conor McGregor. Do you think people will look at that and say, okay, well, we still need somebody like that? Or do you think people can still be satiated with the fact that there are so many good fights on this card?
I think people will probably be on both sides of that argument. But the roster right now, and this may sound hyperbolic, but the roster is just an embarrassment of riches. I've said repeatedly there are 14 Super Bowls a year, right? The one the NFL does and the 13 that the UFC do. And I know most of the fan base, Scott, agrees with that exact sentiment. These pay-per-views are life events, just the live event, the UFC live event as a commodity has never been more in demand. And UFC 299 a few weeks before is a card that could hold up as UFC 300 if it was happening a few weeks later. So, gosh, man, like UFC 298 is my focus right now, and I think that card is absolutely loaded as well. So I apologize if that sounds like promotional hyperbole, but UFC 300 is loaded. I do expect one more undisputed title to be on the line. It's tricky though. There's only a couple of men's titles right now that possibly could land on that date. And there are a lot of different players and masters in that equation. So, I think I'd like to see one more title fight, but gosh, man, like I did a year in review show last year, and I said the fight I think I wanted to see the most in 2024 was Yan Xiaonan versus Zhang Weili, and we're getting it at 300. So I'm pretty happy, man, in terms of what my schedule looks like for the rest of the first quarter.
Now, you mentioned 298. Of course, that is your focus. That is the one that's coming up in just a couple weeks here. Alexander Volkanovski, Ilia Topuria, both just joined a very short list of fighters who've held a title, the UFC title, for 1,500 days. You know, we're in rarefied air with this man. When we're talking about legacies, how much do you value longevity in that equation when you're looking at those top guys?
Well, certainly Volkanovski's 1,500 days is even more impressive because there have not only been no major lapses in terms of the title defenses, but as you know, there have been surgeries, right? He has interspersed surgeries with training camps. And I just have the ultimate respect for Alexander Volkanovski. In terms of legacy, I always talk about championship banners, right? John Jones could have 15 of them hanging in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So the ultimate decider for me in terms of legacy is championship fight wins. But Volkanovski obviously is creeping in that column as well. And just to do it with this type of pace as far as his schedule is concerned is just wicked impressive. And obviously wanting to fight the most dangerous guys, because you can be sure. And Movsar Evloev and Arnold Allen fought a very close fight, but you can be sure that if Volkanovski is able to take Ilia Topuria's zero, that he'll be looking to go take Movsar's if that's what people think is the most dangerous fight. So I think Volkanovski certainly could find himself on the MMA Mount Rushmore at career's end. But yeah, I mean, first ballot Hall of Famer, to say the least, for the ever classy featherweight king.
And of course, the other side of that coin is Ilia Topuria. You know, he seems to be just like waiting to explode in popularity here in the States. He's already very popular abroad. Would you agree with that? Do you see star potential with this guy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he has millions of Instagram followers, and it's not because he's pushing out a bunch of content and all over that application. It's because he just transcends countries and cultures, I think. And he just has a way about him. You know, he's like 007, and he looks the part of future UFC champion, and he's not afraid to say it's a terrible time for Volkanovski to be fighting me on the heels of what happened against Islam Makhachev. You know, he's really a nuts on the table type of guy because he thinks he's the best in the world. And I just did a sit down with him in December when they were doing that seasonal press conference, and we talked about sort of the unheralded nature of his camp and his coaches. And, you know, he feels like the shine is coming for them as well. These people have been putting a lot of hard work in away from the limelight, and they certainly feel like they know what everybody else doesn't, and they're going to show the world at UFC 298.
And the last one I have for you is, you know, looking just a little further down the card. I mean, we could talk about all these fights, but I want to hone in specifically Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo. I mean, this is a major fight at 135 pounds. Marlon Chito Vera, look, he's very well liked, but in a pure meritocracy, which the UFC, I think we can agree, is not necessarily that. Someone like Merab or his teammate Aljamain Sterling, you mentioned earlier, would have gotten the shot at Sean O'Malley for 299 ahead of Chito. When you look at this fight and Merab, like for Merab specifically, what does he got to do to ensure that he can be the next man in line other than get through Henry Cejudo? It's not like he can steal Sugar Sean's
Yeah.
every week.
Yeah. Well, I do think Dana White's track record is very good when it comes to operating in a meritocracy. If you look back historically, 95% of the time, the most deserving contender, I do think, gets the title fight historically. Merab's situation was a little bit unique. I mean, you know, Ray Longo's my buddy, but Aljamain Sterling being the champion, the exiting champion, it was a little bit muddy. But I think all he has to do is beat Henry Cejudo. And even if that is not guaranteed, I think comes with the territory. You win a couple fights as the consensus number one contender, you're getting that championship opportunity. I just think there are a lot of different things that go into it. Timing, right? Merab did have a surgery and maybe he was wrongfully, you know, penalized as far as the calendar is concerned for that. But I think his style, bro, like obviously he has a 5-round style, a championship style that I think will transfer very, very well to title fights and UFC main events. But gosh, man, he's all offense all the time. So promotionally, like, what are you looking for? You know, and he's great on social media. He's great on a microphone in his second or third language. He's the total package. So I don't know, man. I don't worry about his style, right? Like some people criticize other fighters for being point driven or trying to win rounds or wrestle heavy. I mean, Bilal Muhammad is a guy who I think is more offensive than he's given credit, but Merab Dvalishvili is like a million miles an hour. And if he gets by Henry Cejudo, I feel pretty convicted in saying he's going to fight for the title.